of neurons. Dr. Charles Socarides, professor of psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City, said this about the Levy brain study. The question of a minute section of the brain, submicroscopic almost, as deciding sexual object choice is really preposterous. A cluster of the brain cannot determine sexual object choice. Dr. Kenneth Clevington, assistant to the president of the Salk Institute in San Diego, the same institute that Levy researched his study, stated, "There's a body of evidence that shows the brain's neural networks reconfigure themselves in response to certain experiences. Therefore, the difference in homosexual brain structure may be a result of the behavior and environmental conditions." In an interview with Simon Levy about his famous brain study, Levy himself stated the following, "It's important to stress what I didn't find. I did not prove that homosexuality is genetic or find a genetic cause for being gay. I didn't show that gay men are born that way, the most common mistake people make in interpreting my work, nor did I locate a gay center in the brain. Since I look at adult brains, we don't know if the differences I found were there at birth or if they appeared later." In the concluding remarks of their study entitled A Genetic Study of Male Homosexual Orientation focusing on identical twins, Michael Bailey and Richard Pillard rather erroneously stated that homosexuality had some genetic roots. This has emboldened the likes of Kinsey and the advocates of homosexuality to the point of citing it as a source of legitimacy for their despicable sexual acts. The fact that only half of the identical twins researched, that is 52%, had exhibited homosexual tendencies is proof enough that homosexuality cannot be ascribed to genetic roots. In fact, other researchers have disproved this claim. For instance, Jeffrey Stenover, a researcher, in his revealing book entitled Homosexuality and the Politics of Truth, stated that 1 among 5 identical twins committed homosexual acts during their lifetime. Biologist Annie Foster Sterling of Brown University stated, "In order for such a study to be at all meaningful, you'd have to look at twins raised apart. It's such badly interpreted genetics." Dr. Bailey himself stated there must be something in the environment to yield the discordant twins. Even Dr. Simon Levy commented on the Bailey-Pillard twin study by saying, "In fact, the twin studies suggest that it's not totally inborn, because even identical twins are not always of the same sexual orientation." Hammer, who was a molecular biologist in the American National Cancer Institute, was a homosexual himself. His hypothetical research focused on the human genetic makeup. He announced that his research on the X chromosome has discovered a genetic component of some instances of male homosexuality. That is very different from saying that he found a gene that inevitably determines that a man will be homosexual. Hammer never claimed to have done that. Nevertheless, his research results fell on deaf ears since it has never been replicated by similar researchers. In fact, one of Dr. Hammer's fellow research assistants brought him up on charges saying that he withheld some of the findings that invalidated his study. The National Cancer Institute is investigating Dr. Hammer. To date, they have not released the results of this investigation, and Dr. Hammer has left the National Cancer Institute. While he was under investigation for fraud, Hammer is said to have concluded that environment could have a major role in causing homosexual behavior. For instance, in 1998, Time magazine interviewed Dr. Dean Hammer, and he himself emphasized These genes do not cause people to become homosexuals. The biology of personality is much more complicated than that. In an interview with the Associated Press, Hammer commented, "It could be that there was some other physical or biochemical factor involved, or there could be some other non-biological factors related to life experiences or environment or upbringing." So in short, not only does his study fail to show that a single gene determines homosexual orientation, it also does not rule out a number of other possibilities. Dr. Edward Stein, homosexual activist and author of The Mismeasure of Desire, The Science, Theory, and Ethics of Sexual Orientation, critically examines the research of both Hammer and Levy that claim a biological origin to homosexuality. In an interview with The Advocate, a homosexual magazine, Stein said, "There are serious problems with the science itself. My training had taught me that a lot of what was being said was, well, highly unscientific." Stein also explains in his book that none of the researchers studying hypothesized biological origins of homosexuality had proven direct causation, although in some circumstances they claim to have done just that. Homosexuality had long been included in the long list of psychic disorders appearing in the International Classification of Diseases. Vociferous and often violent protests by homosexuality activists during the American Psychiatric Association meetings, spearheaded by the then ardent advocate of homosexuality, Barbara Gittings, exerted political influence to force the Psychiatrists Association to cancel homosexuality from DSM, the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, in 1973, even when it was clear that only a third of the votes were cast on the issue. Dismaying as it might have sounded, members of the APA used Dr. Kinsey's findings as the basis for their argument that homosexuality was genetic. The late Dr. Charles Socarides, a professor of psychiatry in the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City, expressed his grief at this ridiculous decision by saying that although the exclusion of homosexuality from the long list of psychic disorders was no doubt an attempt to correct what was seen as an injustice against homosexuals, it was nonetheless an injustice in its own right. The inclusion was a senseless act which pushed gays further and further away from needing and soliciting societal and medical help, instead forcing them to go their separate ways with the erroneous belief that homosexuality is a normal form of expression of sexual behavior different from but equal to that of heterosexuality. But the world responded to this blunder by another blunder. In 1992, the World Health Organization (WHO) unanimously decided to cancel out homosexuality from the list of psychic disorders in the International Classification of Diseases. A person is said to be homosexual if he or she is sexually or romantically attracted to members of the same sex and act on those feelings to satisfy his desires. This doesn't mean that homosexuals are sexually attracted to all members of the same gender any more than heterosexuals are sexually attracted to every person of the opposite sex. In the homosexual way of doing things, sexual intercourse is conducted with both partners dividing the role of a man and a woman between themselves. Hence one acts as a male or inserter and the other acts as a female receiver.